was a very funny greeting, thank you. I feel shy. Okay. All right. Okay. I really need first to say thank you to EAGT, to the organizers, to the people here in Hungary. You've been kind and helpful. The tears are about I feel kind of humbled and appreciative about being asked to participate. I have felt nothing but welcome here all week, or all weekend. And it means a lot to me, so thank you. But I'm also aware, as I'm standing here, that 4 of your speakers this week, plenary speakers, are native English speakers. All 4 born in the United States. 3 of us still live here. And I feel a little bit embarrassed about that. I was thinking before I was introduced that it's a bit of an imposition on you. Given the reception, I'll take that part back. At least at this moment, I don't feel like I'm imposing on you. And I know that there are a lot of factors that go into making a decision about a keynote speaker or keynote speakers. And I don't know what went into these decisions, but I want to offer you what I started to think about as I watched our panoply of speakers. I think it's one of these moments where I've realized my age, that all of the speakers are from the seniors community. And maybe that's as it should be. I mean, I don't know. The reason I think maybe it should be is that it's a way you honor us. That's part of the way I feel humbled, because I do feel honored. And it's a chance, I guess, part of my purpose in being here, I guess, is to receive that honor and to try to offer some wisdom and then to pass the torch along. Because increasingly, Europeans who want to be read widely are taking the risk of writing in English. And I have to tell you, I feel really grateful for that, because there's incredible clinical and intellectual ferment here in Europe. And your willingness to write in English is a gift to those of us who are monolingual. In America, we are not required to learn languages. So, okay. The other last thing I want to say by way of being here is that I realize we're all suffering together in a time of great tumult and disruption, and even for some of us, a sense of collapse, of impending collapse of democracies, and certainly of the habitability of our planet. The energy I have seen this week from so many of you to use your living, breathing, rich Gestalt therapy to contribute to healing is impressive and has enriched me and nourished me, and thank you for that. Okay. Now, for the topic at hand, I might not have to cry. Okay. I want to cover a few thoughts on this topic that have been stimulated for me, and they are in no particular order, but I will mark each shift, I think. The 0 point, the fertile void. Okay. The good news for me is that the theory of the 0 point in consciousness and the relevance to Gestalt therapy has already been thoroughly covered by Nancy and by Kathleen. And it's one among many strands or ways of understanding our human situation that Pearls, Hefferline, and Goodman draw on. These guys were amazing. They took all these different sources that had influenced them, and they didn't just do what I'm going to do today, which is take bits and pieces, sort of riffs off of the topic. They formed them together in a coherent whole that continues to lead to new thinking. For instance, in my own world, my own sort of psychotherapy and theory development world, I'm particularly interested in drawing out the therapy relationship implications of the fact of the organism-environment field as the source of phenomena. But that's just one example. And I'm spending my entire adult clinical life trying to work that out. Each of us could take one strand and spend your adult clinical life working with it, okay? But so why is the notion of the fertile void so compelling to us? Why does it warrant our attention? Okay, for one thing, the idea about polarities, which is the other part of the fertile void conversation, matches Gestalt psychology epistemology, which is a cornerstone of Gestalt therapy. Polarities are figure and ground. They live in a figure-ground relationship. Well, that's fundamental to perception. So our entire experiential world is organized in terms of figure and ground. But I think there's something more important, and I think it's come up a lot this week, which is that language, the words, fertile void. That set of words together has its own romance to it. It bursts the bounds of clear and distinct ideas. Now, Nancy and Kathleen really made clear and distinct ideas for us to understand from it, as did Friedlander, obviously. So I'm not really talking about the concept right there. I'm talking about the juxtaposition of those two words. There's something romantic, dare I say mysterious, about putting those two words together. Okay, and I think our attraction to that is because it's an attempt to find a place for what cannot be fully grasped, what cannot be fully named or known. It's that something that lives just prior to and works its shaping influence on the forming figures of a Gestalt. Every Gestalt is an individual act of perception, but it's something that emerges from a larger shared world in which that fertile void has a place. And more narrowly, if we think about Jean-Marie Robin's contributions these days, the shared situation. Technically, we can call this forecontact. Obviously, fertile void has a little more romance to it. We might also call it ineffable. Okay. When we pay attention, we can, okay, I'm going to use some languages now that have controversy to them. All these words I'm going to use are meant experientially, not scientifically. Like, here's what I want to say. That when we pay attention, we can sense the coming presence that we call forecontact. Okay, don't hold me to this scientifically, please. But we can feel the sense of a room. We are affected by it. Right now, a word that's controversial, atmosphere. I know that's a politically laden term, but it's another way we're attempting to find our way into ways of understanding and being sensitive to the shaping power of forecontacting. I'm going to speak a bit more about our struggles with the limits of our knowing a little bit later. And although I've spoken abstractly so far, I actually want to stay close to experience and clinical practice pretty much from now on out. I'm going to start with how I experience quite bodily the notion of the fertile void. What happens to me is that the word void frightens me. I don't know all of what's frightening to me about void. I mean, certainly there's unknowing and uncertainty, but those two words don't frighten me. They disrupt me and excite me. Void frightens me. Part of my association to the word void is that I think I only know the void of trauma. A couple of speakers spoke this week about the difference between the void of trauma and the fertile void, the trauma void. In trauma, for me, it's a void in which there is no imagination, no breath, no future. And that's my association to the word void. So, I also have to say, I have a personal and despairing bodily sinking when I'm confronted with the phrase creative indifference. I'm the wrong speaker for these things. And in this case, again, it's personal. And so this is important, I guess. Language is personal to us. There was too much indifference in my household when I was young, so the word indifference is not a neutral one for me. And it's not one that's full of possibility. It's full of estrangement and isolation. I say this not to argue with those words as concepts, but I'm playing with, walking through experientially why those words are not words that show up in my theorizing, at least not often. In fact, fertile void may have never shown up, because it would be wordless. Okay. So, for me, the opposite of the traumatic void is not a fertile void. When I pay attention, it's more a sense of expansive openness, free and easy breathing, a sense of aliveness and vibration. So I wouldn't use the word void. And my awareness is not empty. There's a humming sense of unformed shapes and vague motion. I was going to use the word movement, but movement's even too defined. It's motion. So there's a sense of fallowness, like a field lying fallow, and that's the fertile part. It's not empty. It does have a sense of fertility, but the word void doesn't capture that moment for me. Okay. So does this matter? Well, what it leads me to do is want to try to think about what are the language and concepts I use that others think of the fertile void when they're sort of in the same state. Because I do agree that polarities and figure ground are fundamentals of consciousness, absolutely. And I've recently, in the past 2 or 3 years, become interested once again in polarities, thinking in terms of polarities. And I recognize that the 0 point, still wish it wasn't called zero, it's sort of like void for me, is a place of balance, not stasis, as Don and Bob pointed out, but a wiggling back and forth instead of massive shifts back and forth. And we want our patients to have that flexibility, obviously. However, when I was in workshops as a beginning Gestalt therapist, and this was, obviously I'm old, so it was back in the days where Gestalt therapy had a more confrontive atmosphere to it or tone to it. I remember having a sense that my suffering was being too easily dismissed when it was being cast as one side of a polarity. The well-intentioned therapist would want me to try on the other polarity, and that didn't work for me. So, although I can see the value in terms of thinking about polarities, I'm very cautious about playing with them with my patients. So I realized for me, my grounding in terms of working with the suffering in a way that doesn't necessarily call attention to polarities is I tend to notice something else, which is I notice the investments or the commitments that my patient is making in the pole that they're in. Like a commitment to being, I'll just oversimplify this, to being a good girl. Okay, that's a commitment, it's an investment. We notice that. Obviously there's a polar opposite to that, right? The Janis Joplin bad girl that a lot of good girls would listen to at night in their bedrooms. Okay. But I'm interested in how the patient holds to these investments quite intensely in a way that shrinks your field of vision and it forecloses the complexity that's intrinsic to any experience. My pathway in my own life and with my patients then is to try to support staying engaged with that current commitment. Not aiming at loosening it, not even aiming at hinting that there's another side. Well, unless I'm frustrated or something, which is not what I want to talk about here. I want to talk about good therapy here, when I'm doing my kind of good therapy. Whether I'm the patient or I'm the therapist, what I'm talking about is staying engaged with your current commitment, and as you go more deeply into it, it will complexify. And ultimately, the other pole will enter awareness, right? So I'm actually staying at one pole, okay? But the way it begins to complexify, of course, is as you're staying with it and exploring it, you get a sense of a greater awareness of the significance of the commitment. You might get a sense of how it originated and how it continues to be maintained, how it functions in someone's life. You start to gain some sense of the cost of hewing to the commitment. And of course, an exploration of how that commitment gets invited in our work. What about the way we are together that invites you to make your commitment to being a good girl in the room with me? And all these things, by broadening awareness, by complexifying, I think helps the patient gain more choicefulness about when and where to use that commitment, and more capacity to entertain other commitments, the polar opposite, for instance, okay? Obviously, this approach represents one of my investments. So I think I'm so taken with the paradoxical theory of change. That's part of what I stand on. Again, that would no, I was just about to say it would make me less likely to play with a polarity system in therapy, but that's not right. Because you can play with inviting the patient to move back and forth, in a play, in some game, with some lightness, and you're not going against the paradoxical theory of change. But I guess for me, and therefore it's what I tend to do with my patients, don't we all? I know in my life I wanted to dive more deeply into the investment, into the commitment. I had the sense of, I hoped that by riding through a dark tunnel, I could get to the other side. The thought of trying on the other polarity was an experiment that did nothing for me other than reinforce my belief that my concerns, my investments, my commitments were silly and wrong. So, didn't work for me. I want to circle back to this idea that we're trying to catch things that have no words. My title for this set of next paragraphs is Bounded Self and the Enlightenment. One of the curses that the Enlightenment Project brought upon us is encapsulation. We developed human beings into disembodied, isolated monads. Notice I said we developed human beings this way. I've heard around the conference every now and then people saying it's human nature that blah, blah, blah. I really agree with Frank Stemler, who writes about the human situation. I don't know what we can say about human nature, but we can say something about our shared situation, things we have in common. We're going to die. In the United States, we pay taxes. I mean, it's a joke, right? Death and taxes are the two things we're sure of. But I think human beingness is incredibly malleable. So I don't think that's why I say we developed into disembodied, isolated monads, okay? That's in our malleability with the persistence of kind of Cartesian thinking for a few centuries. Descartes gets all the blame, but he's not the only dude, okay? But through those centuries of the development of Enlightenment thought, until pretty recently, we've developed this sense of having a bounded self, of being a bounded self. There's a psychoanalytic psychologist whose readings I like a lot named Philip Cushman, that's Cushman, and he's an activist. So he writes really about, in our language, we would say, how much we are emergent from our socio-political historical grounds. And he talks about, he has named this thing that we're trying to burst out of, the sovereign self. And it's a belief that we are, actually, in Gestalt therapy, we have some of this. There are some conflicts within our original Gestalt theorizing, some terms that don't sit easily together, or some notions. And one is Sartrean existentialism that says you create your life and you are, it's where we got this idea of response able, that you are, he would say, we're not responsible for the rain, but we are responsible for how we live with being rained on. And he made that into the sine qua non of being human was kind of full responsibility for your life, versus field theory and phenomenology that point us towards how much we are made, as we make ourselves and we are made. And part of what we have to do to break through this idea of the sovereign, in the sovereign self, there's a very big emphasis on a person's sense of agency. I don't want to give that up. I think a patient having a sense of agency is crucial to their dignity. However, the Sartrean kind of existentialism may have been one extreme of a polarity. The other polarity being we have nothing to say about our emergence of a field, which forgets, and Peter Phillipson points this out repeatedly, when we act like that, we're forgetting that we are part of the field that we are creating. We're making and being made, is what I keep wanting to emphasize. We keep trying to, we may go to extremes to try to break out of this idea of sovereign self. Philosophers, psychoanalysts, Gestalt therapists, historians have been trying to help us break out now for over a century, maybe longer. And we're only partly successful. So, when we live in the world of a sovereign self, we can define what therapy is and how it works, because you can develop an instrumental set of definitions. I do this. We have found experimentally that when I, as the therapist, do this, the majority of patients respond in X way, okay? When we're no longer trying to live as the sovereign self, treating a sovereign self who appears to have impairments in their agency, we have to grapple newly with the questions that have always plagued psychotherapy, which is, how does therapy work? And what is its purpose and meaning? I'm eager for those questions to be alive in our more contextually embedded, contextually emergent way of thinking and carrying ourselves now. And I have to say, at this point, I don't even want to try to answer these questions. I just want to keep them floating around. All I can say that I know, this is being a little bit extreme, but all I can say that I know at the art, the only thing I know is that the art of intimate and meaningful dialogue is the reason I get up in the mornings. And people are willing to take the time and pay the money to keep me company and have these conversations all day. What could be better, right? Okay. The insurance companies and national health programs and whatever are still locked into the instrumentality mindset, which puts quite a strain on us, since that's not the mindset that we live in. That's not the way we walk the therapy talk. Okay. But another question that becomes very important is, what is the place of a sense of agency? Let me say this differently. What is the place of agency when we also recognize that we are emergent of field and context? What are the conditioners at play in this particular field, in my particular field at this moment? How can I ever fully know them? How do I work knowing that I cannot know them? And we can't. We pick out certain ones that we can grab hold of. But we must live with uncertainty. Okay. We've become so really interested in forecontact because we get it more and more that is where the antidote to the sovereign self lives. Okay? So we want to try to learn more about it, and we're fumbling around for ways to do that. Let's keep fumbling. Okay. We're struggling to find words and concepts that capture the ineffable affects of the process of emergence and phenomena that underlie every moment. I have found Jean-Marie Robin's notion of the situation incredibly helpful. So that'll be the next part of my talk. Need a moment? Yeah, okay. In this idea of the situation, there are things I can hold on to in my work as a therapist that are more concrete. And it helps. Okay, as Jean-Marie Robin talks about, in the id of the situation, that's the forecontacting. Okay, he's offering us some ways to think about forecontacting. I hope I'm getting that right, and I don't know if you're in the room, Jean-Marie, or have left already. Oh no, he had to leave. Right. The best I can do is give you my read on it at this point. He's going to listen to the tape, so he'll let me know. Which I forgot to do my tape recorder. Oh well. I guess he won't listen to the tape. Sorry, Jean-Marie. Could that be why? Okay. Anyway. But when I think about when the situation, for better and worse, puts constraints on contacting. There's a cool sociopsychologist, I think, named Gergen, Gergen, who writes about how even the most spontaneous conversation is following rules of engagement. Like you're sitting with somebody who's grieving the loss of somebody. If you got up on the table and danced right then, you would be seen as psychotic. No, there's certain rules of engagement that happen, that shape the contacting moment by moment, okay? Therapy, the situation of therapy is comprised by its structure, for one thing, right? I realize some of you work in the community and you may be meeting teenagers on a park bench somewhere or something like that. I'm going to take the more quotidian, ordinary therapy situation for the moment. The structure is usually a certain time, certain place, the same furniture, regularity of meeting, a fee structure. For some of us, external ethical and legal constraints. That structure is a holding environment, not just for the patient, but for us as well. I have capacities to be present in certain very difficult situations with patients, in part because I know the session will end. I don't have to go home with that person. I don't have to deal with their rage over the dinner table. So that's one. But also, the situation of therapy is structured in large part by norms. Norms, I would say, I've tended to underrate the value of norms in terms of their importance until President Trump became elected. And we've begun to see, for instance, in our country, and I know there's similar things happening over here, that norms, despite our system of laws, it's norms that keep our fragile democracy going. So we're in a little trouble now. And I think norms, some of those norms, drew us to this work in the first place. If you consider ethics as part of the norm, and here I don't mean the legislative ethical systems that are in some ways problematic for our genuine ethic, but really the ethic that Levinas named, which is that the face of the other constitutes an ethical command, and we, the therapists, respond, I am here. I don't think you get into this work unless you're compelled by that ethic. I didn't know it was an ethic, I just thought it was my love of intimate, meaningful conversation and my care. But it turns out Levinas really locates it then as the central ethic of being a human being. Norms require our art, our creative engagement, our integrity, and the Levinasian ethic. All of which to say, and here's kind of paradoxical, the situation is bigger than we are. We can't predict and control. And it has a compelling force upon us. And yet it's also contingent on us and the qualities and intentions that we bring. Because again, there's no inside and no outside. We could say, I don't know how to say this without it being boundaried. We are part of the situation. It's better to say we are of the situation, but I'm kind of playing right now with this idea of the situation lives through us, and we co-make the situation. So it's making and being made at the same time. I hope that makes sense, or opens up some associations that you can play with. We do comprise an aspect of the situation. We affect and are affected by it. So our intention is a factor. And it's one that I remind myself of when I'm struggling with a patient. Margarita Spagnola-Loeb has taught us, and others from the group who learned with her, studied with her, that there's always direction in our contacting. At some level we've known this, but she's lifted it out. It's always both a response and an initiation. This is one of the things I think that maybe when you're in the existential Sartrean mode, you forget. You're never not responding. You're never not being affected by your situation. Whether it's as simple as the fact that the hairs on my arm right now are a little raised every time I move outside the spotlight, every time my arm moves below the spotlight, it goes from warmth to cold and the hairs raised. Our environment is never, I hope this translates well out of English, it's never indifferent. We are always living in a non-indifferent world. My senses are only drawn towards things that are making a difference. Okay, just kind of throwing that out. But see, the significance that has for me is I'm always working uncertainly, but all I have to go on is that by which I'm affected, which means I can never fully know this context. Why does that matter? Because when a patient says something to me that, let's say, reflects an aspect of their character style, or says something about me that reflects an aspect of their character style. That thing is also a response to this context, including this moment. So instead of creative indifference, as I possibly have misunderstood the term, I'm much more interested in asking this question: what is it about how we are being together? And sometimes much more specifically, what is it about how I am being with you that brings this particular experience into the foreground now? Even if it's an experience that they've had repeatedly many times in their lives, it's not an experience they have every moment of their lives. So what is it in this moment? And the reason that's a valuable question to ask is because if we go back to we're making and being made, the patient and I are being made in that moment. It gives rise to that experience that the patient is speaking. And as we explore and make sense of it, that provides a chance to gain a greater sense of agency. I don't know whether agency really exists, but gaining a sense of agency is empowering and dignifying. I want to ask, does this make sense? But I realize the room is too big to ask that to. And so to me, there's something about, what I'm trying to say is that the situation provides a relatively safe ground in which we can look at making and being made together. And we can look at how much agency we have and don't, and we can build a greater sense of agency. There's a wonderful article that I read years ago by Sally Dannenbaum. Apparently she's a little embarrassed about it now, but that's too bad, called Will and Grace. And that's what we go back and forth with. Not the Sartrean total agency, and not total surrender, but some will, some grace, back and forth. To me, that's one of these, if you will, polarities, where we like to do this, okay? So I'm going to move on. The transition here is not smooth at all, it's just plunk. I'm going to go in another direction, I think. I think it's a plunk. Because I want to go to the title of my talk, which is Engaged Surrender. And I add to that, engaged surrender and the double nature of the power of the situation. Instead of fertile void, instead of creative indifference, I'm drawn to the notion of engagement and surrender. As I've said before many times, I love the art of therapeutic dialogue. I'm going to make it in my time frame, but it's going to push into the next segment. I'm sorry. And part of that art includes moments where I speak with intensity to a patient, or I offer an argument, or a tear. And then I let go. I'm able to open myself to whatever comes next, even if what comes next does not at all match what I had hoped or what I was striving for in the intention of my movement toward the patient. It had a direction. I'm going where I think is a good idea to go. But once I've put my foot out there into that journey, I then can emotionally withdraw that investment because I'm also interested in just what happens next, even if it's not what I hoped for. So, because I'm now in a new moment, I just surrender to that moment. I hope that makes some sense. It's a process of invested engagement and surrender. And when I let the intention of my move towards something, when I let that intention recede, A new interest in the next moment, the coming moment, is what attracts my attention. Okay. I don't know why this paragraph is in here, but I'm going to use it. Oh, I know, because it has to do with the indifference. I'm not sure that we ever, I know this is what's not technically meant by indifference, but as I was saying before, we don't live in an indifferent world. We're never indifferent. We're always coming from a perspective. Some things emerge as figures and some things don't because they are not of interest to us. So what does this mean clinically? Well, for example, let's say you see tears in the eyes of your patient. How you respond to that has different qualities. And you say this simple sentence, I see tears. But do you say it as if you believe you are a neutral observer and you just say, I see tears? You're never neutral, okay? Or is it a resonant moment? I see tears. Or is it a slight question? I see tears? All of these different ways of saying the exact same observation position you differently. You're never neutral, okay? This idea that we live in a non-indifferent world, by the way, is one of the ideas I love from American pragmatism. We're never without prejudice. We're never without bias. Okay. Okay. I may. Okay. Now, here's the thing. When I talk about the double-sidedness of the situation, there's two sides to the coin of the norms, the ethics, even the rules in this case of the situation. It requires of me that I stay, even in a conversation I don't want to be having. When I'm at a cocktail party and I'm trying to engage in a conversation that's meaningful and the other person doesn't engage in a way that's satisfying to me, I can move on. In therapy, we can't do that. I cannot escape my part in whatever difficulties we're having by simply telling myself that so-and-so and I are not going to develop this attempt at conversation any further. I'm to a certain degree helpless in the face of how I'm activated by the pressures of the situation. And yet it's also the situation that supports me to simply sigh and admit ruefully my problem. Had a patient, and he and I was reactive to his stubborn hunger for me to find the right way to meet him and refusal to respond in a welcoming way to any way I tried to reach him. And I became stubbornly withholding. And finally, at the end of one of my sessions, I've talked about this before, I said, I don't like the way I am being with you. I forget exactly the words, they're in an article, but it was something like I know I said I'm withholding. I think I might have said I'm angry and withholding and I like this. Because I couldn't leave the situation. And I was out of other ideas. So what's left? Be myself. So I told him. And in that case, a therapeutic turn happened, because it turned out he had thought up until then that I knew exactly what I was doing at every moment. And so he felt oppressed by my knowing, what he thought was my knowing. And since I felt lost a lot of the time, that was interesting, but it makes me wonder how much the way I spoke with him was a reaction to my feeling lost by taking a more authoritarian stance. I don't know. We actually didn't pursue that part. It was just so exciting for him to realize that he had assumed something that my confession told him differently. that we just went on from there. It wasn't a response I would have expected or predicted. All I can know is that in the situation, I have learned to trust the honest dialogue done with underlying goodwill. And that somehow takes us to a new possibility. And again, for me, that's about staying with the situation within the paradoxical theory of change. I gave up trying to change myself or him, just spoke my truth. So, to end, rather than 0 point or fertile void, my attitude is the paradoxical theory of change, which I believe requires a kind of engaged surrender. I live my investment pretty fully for a moment, and then I let go. And now it's time for me to let go. Thank you very much.